Welcome back to the podcast of our series called It's Complicated. It's a study of sexuality with the Naperville Church of Christ Youth Ministry. This week we only met one time in the morning, and this past Sunday morning what we discussed was the idea of singleness, or what we titled God as My Lover. I think it's incredibly important for our students and for our parents to understand as well the place and the role of singleness in a Christian life. The simple fact of the matter is that many of our students who sit with us in class on Sunday morning will live a good portion of their life, and possibly all of their lives, as single people. And the sad fact is that the church has a really hard time knowing what to do with single people, and the only solution that most churches come up with is, let's put them all in a room and try to fix them so that so they're not single anymore. Let's get them all together and hopefully they'll marry each other, and then we won't have to worry about them being single anymore. And I think that's a very, very poor message that we send to our church, to our students, and certainly to those in our churches that are single. And I think the Bible has some things that contradict that message pretty strongly as well. One of the most important questions for any Christian person to ask themselves is, how do I define who I am? Now, this is different from describing who you are. Describing who you are says, I'm a guy, and I'm however tall that I am, and I like to go for long walks on the beach, and that's describing yourself. Defining yourself is looking deep inside and saying, this is who I am in the most important and real way. And that's a crucial question for all people to ask, and especially as we even consider relationships in any way. If we define ourselves by who we are, or who we are with rather, it's going to kill our relationships. We started at the very beginning with what we call the golden rule of relationships, that says if you try to find intimacy with somebody else before doing the hard work of figuring out who you are, your relationships then become some sort of attempt to complete yourself by somebody else, and they're going to fail. Very, very critical for those in our world and our churches who are single to be able to define themselves well. And this really comes from an idea, an understanding of passages like Matthew chapter 22. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is approached by the Sadducees, and they're frankly just trying to trick him, and they give him this story, this explanation where a guy was married and died, and under Jewish law, his brother was then required to take his wife and to have children with her to allow the family to continue. And this happened 7 times with 7 brothers, and they all died. And the question the Sadducees asked Jesus was, who's married to the woman at the resurrection? And Jesus' response was to tell them, look, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know the scripture, and you don't know the power of God. He said at the resurrection, people aren't married. People are like the angels at the resurrection. In other words, at the resurrection, in our purest form, when Christ returns and we are all with God forever and all of eternity, everybody's single. Or maybe more properly put, God is everybody's only lover. Now this blows people's minds a little bit at times, because our assumption is, I'm married to my wife Christina, and when we get to heaven, we'll be there, and we'll be there with our kids and our family and all those things. And I'm not saying we won't be together, but Jesus is stating very, very clearly, we won't be married. That doesn't happen. There's no coupling, family, grouping. None of those things happen in heaven, because in heaven, it is all about God. And we are perfectly content, and by perfectly, I mean perfectly in the fullest sense of the word, content to be with God as our lover. And we're there together, and our loved ones, I believe, will be with us, but nobody's married. And so you could say that in the purest definition of who we really are, we are just us and God. And that's a crucial thing for the church to wrestle with, because again, the church has for so long made it such a disease is probably too strong a word, but such a difficulty if people are single, that we look at them and think, well, we need to fix that, or there's something wrong with that person that they're single. And part of what we learn from Scripture is Jesus is saying, look, in your purest form, when you're in heaven, you're going to be single again. Okay? Now, on a practical level, many of our people are single for long periods of time. They're single until they get married, and for some people that's well into their adult years. And then many are single again after they're married, whether it's because of divorce, God forbid, or if a spouse dies. Okay? People spend a lot of their lives as single, and we need to have some concept of how to deal with that. And I guess the first step is for all of us to start to think, that single is actually a very normal way to live, and it may even be a very holy way to live. Another interesting passage to look at when we talk about being single is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, in the first 9 verses or so. Paul's saying, look, here's the situation. There is a lot of sexual immorality in the world, and because of that, a lot of people are better off getting married. Okay? And then he says, look, if you get married, a man should have one wife, and a wife should have one husband, and they should be faithful to each other. They should consider their bodies to be the property of the other person. They shouldn't withhold themselves from each other. And then he says there's something really interesting as he comes down toward the end of that section. He says, I say all this as a concession, not as a command. He says, I wish that all of you were as I am, which is single. He says, but each of you has your own gift from God. One is this gift and another that. And now to the married and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. What Paul is saying is really an interesting thing. Paul is giving actually a very high view of singleness and a lower view of marriage, which completely contradicts everything that we think about in our culture for sure, and certainly within the church. Paul says, look, marriage is something that is perfectly fine and has a lot to even teach the church about fidelity and about our relationship with God. Marriage is not that marriage is bad. Okay, he's not saying that. He's saying, but to be honest with you, I think marriage is a lesser good. I think singleness is the better good, because singleness allows a person to be fully and completely dedicated to the service of God. One of my friends yesterday, Michael Cho, who was here with us to preach in our sermon, in our worship service yesterday, said singleness is one of those gifts that nobody wants God to give them. That they all, people might consider, that's a great thing that you can be fully dedicated to God, but it's one of those gifts that nobody really wants, right? But what Paul is saying here is, look, there's something very significant about being single, and that you're allowed and capable of giving your entire self over to your service to God. And the simple fact of the matter is that when you're married, especially when you have children, but even if you're just married, it's not just about you trying to give your entire life to God. Now you're giving a portion of that life to your spouse. Again, that's fine and acceptable and godly in many, many ways. Okay, but what Paul is saying is really, when it comes down to your Christian life, single is probably better. So ultimately, as we wrapped up our discussion with our teens, what I want them to see, it's not that I'm necessarily lobbying for them to stay single. I'm definitely lobbying for them to stay single right now, and to not put too high a value even on dating relationships. But long term in their lives, to see that our real call is to live for God right now, right where we are, whether that's through times of singleness in our life or through times of marriage, but that God always, always is the defining force in our lives, that it is by Him and only by Him that we define ourselves. And it's not by our marriages or our families or our jobs or our educations or anything else. And again, just to encourage you all, anybody that ever happens to hear my voice, for the church to give singleness a real place at the table, for the church to give singleness the honor that it's due as people who have the opportunity to dedicate themselves fully and completely to living a life that is focused on their love for God and expressing that love to other people in ways that, frankly, married people just can't